Seeing Jacob running away, Mrs. Wilson was angry to death. She shouted in grief and angrily, "How can there be such a child? It doesn't matter if his own mother is beaten? Is this still a human? It's just a beast." But what she didn't know was that the woman on the opposite side was almost shocked. She didn't know any rift in the relationship between Jacob and Mrs. Wilson, but she knew that the two were in a mother-child relationship. She thought with horror in her heart, "This old woman and the man are obviously mothers and sons, but they don't live in the same villa. Instead, they bought two of the best villas to live next to each other, one set A04 and one A05. What kind of damn family is this? How much money does the family have to take advantage of? How much energy must be behind it?" When she thought of this, she regretted the trouble she had just made to find the old lady. So, she hurriedly apologized in a low voice. "Lady, I'm so sorry, I really didn't expect you to be a resident of the villa area. I blamed myself for just now, please don't be like me." Mrs. Wilson scolded angrily. "You slapped me, and then you're done by saying sorry?" The woman hurriedly asked again. "Then how do you want to solve it, or tell me how can I calm you down? Why don't you slap me? No matter how many times you slap me, I won't fight back." Mrs. Wilson gritted her teeth, and at that time she wished to rush over and smack the woman's face. However, she thought carefully, although I smoked her to relieve my hatred, it has no practical effect. Instead of this, it is better to ruin her for some money. Thinking of this, Mrs. Wilson said coldly, "You scolded me and slapped me in the face. You have to give me a little compensation for everything, right?" The woman nodded without hesitation. "You are right. I am willing to actively compensate. You can say the number. How much is it? I will pay you." Mrs. Wilson originally wanted to bid 10,000. But after thinking for a moment, she felt that calling 10,000 was not appropriate. The current Mrs. Wilson is no longer the old lady like Lafayette before. Mrs. Wilson had a lot of money in her hands, let alone 10,000, 1 million might not really be in sight. However, the current Mrs. Wilson has spent a whole day pulling plastic bags in the supermarket for 100, so 10,000 is a huge sum of money for her now. So, the old lady thought to herself, after all, she just slapped me. If I ask her for 10,000, what if she gets angry and calls me an extortionist? Isn't it going to take me back to the detention center? In these days, it is not easy to make money. I am exhausted all day working, and only earn 100 a day. It would be a bargain to get 100 for a slap. Wouldn't it be called extortion? Thinking of this, Mrs. Wilson said sharply, "I'm so old, you slap me. The problem can be big or small, but I have always been generous. You give 100, this matter is even a flip. 100? The woman's eyes almost fell to the ground. She originally thought that since this old lady could afford to live in Villa A04, there must be some awesome people at home, and if she beat her today, it was really a mess. Therefore, even if Mrs. Wilson asked her for 180,000, she also decided to agree without hesitation, and then transfer the funds as quickly as possible to settle the matter. Unexpectedly, when the old lady spoke, it only cost 100. She was so happy that she nodded and said, no problem. I'll get you the money." As she said, she took out her wallet, took out 100 in cash, and handed it to Mrs. Wilson, then pointed to the security guard and said, "Lady, we have a witness here. You just said it to 100, and I have given you the money now. You can't trouble me anymore." Mrs. Wilson was very happy when she held this 100 bill. She thought to herself, this makes 100 for a slap, which is more cost-effective than working hard for a day. So, she suppressed the excitement in her heart and said, "Okay, forget about it. Remember from now on, when you go out, don't look down on people." The other party immediately nodded respectfully. "Don't worry, I must remember." When Mrs. Wilson arrived home with 204 large plastic bags, the smell of food was permeating the house. The three cooks are Gina and the others. They were working as cleaners in the supermarket today, 120 a day. 3 people are 360. This year, 363 people spent in a restaurant, that is, an ordinary meal. But if you cook and eat carefully, these 306 are still very rich. Gina and the others are all from the countryside, and they are quite real. When they think of being tired for a day, they want to eat more meat to reward themselves, so they bought 2 caddies of pork at the vegetable market, and bought some potatoes, beans, and vermicelli. When got home, they went straight to a pot of stew. Although the cost of a pot of stew is less than 100, the portion is really sufficient, and the scent of the pork cannot be suppressed by the range hood. What's more interesting is that Gina turned off the cooker hood when the simmering pot started to simmer. Then she deliberately opened the door of the kitchen in order to let the fragrance spread a little wider. For Noah and Harold on the 2nd floor, this was simply great torture. This kind of stew, although there is no tall countertop, it is one of the most practical, most appetizing and most greedy dishes for ordinary people. What's more, Noah and Harold are almost hungry and confused. When they are extremely hungry, their sense of smell becomes extremely sensitive, so a little fragrance can make them crazy. The 2 of them thought they were cooking at home, and they wanted to eat it quickly, but they called Horia to ask and realized that the rice was not made by their own family, but by 3 new tenants. This made the father and son despair to the extreme. Wendy and Horia were equally desperate. At this moment, Mrs. Wilson pushed in with a dark face. As soon as she entered the door, she cursed and said, "The 3 old women in the countryside are so presumptuous. The restaurant clearly has a table, and even ran to the coffee table to eat. You really treat this as own home." Seeing her come in, Wendy said with excitement, "Grandma, finally you are back. We are almost starving to death. We waited for you to come back and bring us food." Harold also cried and said, "Grandma, I'm really hungry. If I don't eat, I will starve to death." Mrs. Wilson sighed, handed the 4 plastic bags in her hand to Wendy, and said, "This is for you. Go get a few sets of dishes and eat quickly." Seeing the plastic bags in her hand, the Wilson family didn't care about where the food came from. They just wanted to eat all into their stomachs quickly. So, Wendy said excitedly, "Grandma, I will go to the kitchen to get the tableware." Horia was also very happy and hurriedly said, "You can't finish it by yourself. I'll be with you." Mrs. Wilson coldly snorted, "Horia, stop. Don't eat the food I brought back."